Well, we're going to start a new series today, and this is a series that is simply called The Parables. A parable is a short story or a small story that tells a really big point, and it was actually one of Jesus' favorite ways of teaching. He loved to tell parables because in the parables, people had to kind of think about the story and how it applied. Jesus understood intrinsically that a truth caught is deeper than a truth taught. And so he would do these parables so people would have to catch what it is he would say, and it would apply into their lives. And so for the next, 6 weeks, we are going to go through a bunch of parables. We have some guest speakers coming up in this series, and I'm very excited about it. But today, to start us off, I'm going to speak about what is potentially the most well-known parable that there is, the parable of the prodigal son. It's one that has been translated into TVs and movies and writings for many, many years. And I think it's because it's one of the universal stories. The stories of fathers and sons and of rebelliousness and forgiveness. And it all comes together in this beautiful story. And I think God's got something pretty special for us today in it. And so as we move into it, I'm going to actually encourage you to take a moment. Because what I find in church, and I find this from my own experiences, it's very easy to come to church to sing the songs, drink the coffee, and just be. But I think that there's something holy about taking some time, a moment, that's just between you and God, and get yourself in that place of saying, God, speak to me now. Because when we don't prepare our hearts, what it is you hear me ramble until you go home and then you can have lunch. And that's honestly the best part of Sundays. We all know that. Well, my heart is that you would take a moment and you would listen for the voice of God. So let's take 10 seconds and just in silence, close your eyes. And if you're a believer, talk to God and ask him to prepare your heart. And if you're not a believer here, but you're visiting us this morning, maybe just take a moment and settle your heart and your soul and say, maybe, God, if you're real, you might say something to me. Let's take a moment. The parable of the prodigal son is found in the book of Luke, chapter 15, starting in verse 11. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to the father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to the servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of his servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you killed the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. I'm curious on how this story speaks to you. Do you see yourself in it? At different points in my life, I have been all three of the characters in this passage. And we're going to look at that. This passage became alive to me in a deeper way when I read a book that was called The Return of the Prodigal Son by Henry Nouwen. If you like books, it's small, it's easy to read, but it is so powerful. And he looks at this painting, which is called The Return of the Prodigal Son by Rembrandt, a Dutch painter who is considered the greatest, actually, Dutch painter there ever was. And this story and how it melds the picture and the parable together, and it is absolutely beautiful. And it called me into a deeper love of my Father, God, with it. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at this from the three perspectives of the younger son, the father, and the older son. The younger son, right? He goes to his father. The younger son, he's number two in the family. He is tired of life on the farm. He thinks that maybe there's something better somewhere else. He longs to be in the city where life is exciting. And he goes to the father and he says, Father, give me my share of the estate. And you and I, in 21st century North America, might look at this and go, you snot-nosed little kid. That's kind of bold to ask that. But in the context of first century Israel, what the younger son has done in this story is supremely embarrassed the family. And he has looked his father in the eye and has in essence said to him, I wish you were dead. For to ask for the estate before the parent has died is in paramount or is tantamount to saying that I wish you were dead. The audacity, the vehemence, the rage in this young man to say this to his father is unparalleled. This was a shocking statement for those who originally heard Jesus say this. And so the father gives them the property, and the younger son takes it. In order to have this in liquid cash, he would sell off his part, and he takes off to a distant country. He takes off to a distant country. And what he does is when he goes on a trip, like all of us, he takes a bag with him. I just traveled recently, and I'm traveling again tomorrow. I know the importance of having a bag that's the right size. And so this is my backpack here. I love this backpack. My wife has gotten it for me. But the younger son takes his backpack. But this is not a backpack that you would take and you would fill with your socks, your shirts, and your tidy whities or anything like that. This is a backpack that would fill with something else. This would be like taking a backpack and filling it with guilt, saying, I have now dishonored my father and said, I wish you were dead. And I'm taking the family farm, and I'm going to divide it up so it's now worth less and can make less money and break that. And he's going to fill his backpack with this. And then he's going to go on a trip. And you know what? It's okay. I can live with this. This backpack is not that heavy. I can feel a little bit of weight. It's going to sit on my bones a bit, but it's okay. I can still move around. And the younger son goes off now with his backpack with a little bit of guilt in it, and he now goes to a distant country. And I don't know what the distant country looks like, and I don't know what the wild living specifically looks like. I picture weekend in Vegas. I picture him throwing money around like crazy. I picture him buying drinks for people, experimenting with stuff, finding anybody who would spend time with him. And what he ends up doing over his time is he continues to add to his backpack. And he all of a sudden, maybe in his wild living, now develops a problem with drinking, and he overdoes it. And maybe now in his wild living, he engages in a lot of sex with various partners, and he brings that down. And maybe even in his wild living, he begins to experiment with drugs. And all of a sudden now, this backpack that was a little bit bearable is now a lot heavier. It's now sitting on him in a really painful way where it sits into his bones and it's going to make every step in his life harder. And I wonder if he realized that when we walk in disobedience, it creates distance. And I wonder how many of us know that too. That when we walk in disobedience to our Father in heaven, it actually creates a relationship distance between us and him. God doesn't move, but we get weighed down with this burden sitting on our backs, making each step more and more difficult, more and more painful because of our disobedience. And the only way that it seemed to the younger son to medicate his problem was to add another brick to the backpack. And then that would wear off, and then he would add another brick. Until all of a sudden now, all the money is gone. He's got nothing left. He's bought as many drinks. The friends disappear. Life challenges happen. And a severe famine hits in this land. And he's got no money. He's got no resources. He's nowhere near home. And the only thing he can do now is to hire himself out to this foreign person who in this other country. And the guy puts him into a field working with the pigs. Which if you understand anything in Jewish history and Jewish thing, the pig farmer was a despised profession among all things, for pigs were an unholy creature. They were an unclean creature. You couldn't eat them. So to be a pig farmer is like the worst job. Well, with the exception of being the hired person, you're not even the boss. You're just the hired person out working with the pigs. And he is so hungry, and he's carrying this backpack of guilt around it, that he looks down at the food the pigs are eating, and he wishes he was eating as well as them. That's what he's dreaming of. He wishes he could eat there. And so what happens is he spends time in this emotional place with this backpack weighing him down, hunger in his belly, and then he comes to that place that we colloquially call here rock bottom. And I don't know if you in your life have ever come to that place where you've hit rock bottom. There is an actual beautiful clarity in that moment that strips away all of the lies that you've told yourself for years and all of the lies that the world tries to tell you. And in that moment, he understood that he needed to make a change. And what I find fascinating in the story here, it says when he came to his senses, he goes, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? What I find fascinating when I look at that is that he is not drawn because of how bad he is, but by how good his father is. That his father is so good to the hired servants that they live a better life than him. And so it's the goodness of the father that actually draws him now back to saying, I want to come back home to him. And so what does he do? With his backpack filled with guilt, he begins to set out and go back. And on the way there, he's continually telling himself over and over, he's practicing what he's going to say. You ever do that? You ever have like a really nervous meeting and you begin to practice what you're going to say? And then you also speak for the other person as well, right? And you're like, okay, this is what they're going to say to me, and I'm going to say this back. And Sometimes it works out that way, sometimes it doesn't. I do that all the time. I practice what I'm going to say to you before I come up and do this all the time. He's practicing on the walk home. And as he's walking, he's like, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. Hold on, church, let me just do a little pause there. Do you recognize that? That when you sin against another person, you're also sinning against the God who made that person. It's a double problem. And both need to be addressed. The younger son sees that. The prodigal son sees that. So he goes, Father, I've sinned against heaven. I've sinned against my heavenly father. I've sinned against my earthly father. And so now I've sinned against heaven and against earth. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. I'm not worthy enough to be your kid anymore. I'm not worthy enough to be in the family, but maybe you'll be nice enough to hire me and give me a job so that I don't die. And I wonder how many of us sometimes can do this too. That our guilt of this pack that we're carrying on our bones can cause us to start to feel unworthy of being called a child of God, a son of God, a daughter of God, because we're feeling this over and over in our lives. With every single step, it gets heavier and heavier. But while he's still a long way off, the father sees him, was filled with compassion. He runs to his arms and he kisses him. And the son begins to say his line that he's been practicing. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But what I find fascinating is when you read this, the father's barely even listening to him. The father interrupts him. Because as soon as instead of having the son continue on, make me like one of your hired servants, the father's already turned away and looking at the servants. Hold on, we got some work here to do. We got a robe. Go get the best robe. Why? Because the father wants to actually give him a symbol of honor. Go get a ring. The ring was a symbol of authority. He's actually restoring him to be a son again. And go get him some sandals. Well, in the first century Israel, slaves went barefoot. The hired people probably went barefoot, but the children, the sons, would wear sandals. So go get sandals. And so what's happened here is as he has come home, the Father God has come and taken this backpack of all of this pain, all of this guilt, and he takes it off of his son and restores his son to being a place of worship of him. The father so loved his son. And then they celebrate. Well, the second person in our story is the father. And make no mistake, this story is not the story about the prodigal son. He is not the hero of the story. He is actually not even the first person you're supposed to identify with. How does this story start in the passage? It says there was a man who had two sons. This story is about the man. It is about the father. And it is about how his expression happens. He stands there one day. He has built an empire of farming for his family. And then he's continuing to work it. He is the patriarch, and it's a patriarchal society. So he is the owner of everything. Everything goes through him. The sons are kind of like hired workers who will inherit everything later. And his youngest son has come up to him and said, I wish you were dead. Give me my share of the estate. I wonder if any of us know anybody who want all the blessings from the Father, but don't want relationship with the Father. His son wanted all the money. He wanted everything that was owed to him, but he didn't want relationship with the Father. How many people long for heaven, but don't want to know Jesus? How many people want that? But the Father hears this. And I don't know about you, I would react in a very peculiar way. I can identify with the father a little bit. My youngest daughter, who you can kind of hear yelling in the background a little bit, her name is Hannah. Hannah has autism. So I do not blame Hannah for anything, but for most of my parenting life, Hannah has rejected me. I come home, and as soon as I come in home, she will look at me and say, goodbye, like go back away. Don't want you around here. Don't need you. I got mom. That's all I need. And I understand that, right? When Abby's around, I feel like that's all I need as well. But I understand Hannah doing that, and I know she doesn't mean it, but I feel like this constant place of rejection. Every time I try to shower her with my love, she pushes away. She doesn't want that anymore. And so I can, in some degree, identify with the father here a little bit. And if my son, or if my older daughter Rebecca were to come to me and say, Dad, I wish you were dead. Give me all the money that I'm going to inherit. Well, there'd be two things that could happen. It could go either way. I could go off and cry in a fetal position in the corner, or I'm going to be like, girl, what are you thinking about? And there's going to be a slap upside the head, and we're going to have it out, right? Because this is so insulting that she would want the things that I want to give her later, but she doesn't want me. She's rejecting me. And I'm amazed because when I look at the father here, what does the father in the story do? He writes the check. What does he actually do is he takes the farm and he divides the farm into 3 sections. He gives 1 section to the younger son. He gives 2 sections to the older son, because in Deuteronomy 29, that was the law. The older son would get a double portion. And so he'd probably get all the equipment and stuff, and then there's this plot of land the younger son would get. And then the younger son would take that land, and then he would sell it off in order to have the cash from it. So now the farm, which was 3 sections, is now reduced to 2. So its long-term earning potential is actually reduced. And the father's no longer even the owner. It's now the younger, or the older brother's the owner. But as patriarch, all of the income would still come to him. But the son has done all these things, and then he leaves, and the father doesn't know where he goes. Can you imagine your child leaving, and you don't know where they are or what's going on in their life? You don't know if he's dead or alive. But every day the father comes out and he leans up on the rest of the fence, and he looks down the long country lane, and he's hoping that his son will come, but he doesn't know. He's still waiting. Again, if it was me, because I'm sinful and I'm flawed, I would be sitting there, and every day I'm looking at that, I'd probably be getting a little bit more resentful. I'd be getting a little bit more frustrated, a little bit angrier. I'd be feeling that insult deeper. But the father in the story is different. He's different than me. He stands there, and then eventually when you see his heart, because when he sees this small shape way down the country lane beginning to walk with the familiar walk of a son, because parents, you guys will know this, you can tell which one is your kid a ways away, right? He can see his kid coming towards him. He sees the brokenness, and the father doesn't react with vindictiveness of like, I knew this wouldn't work out for you. I knew you'd fail. I knew you'd blow it. I knew that. He doesn't do that. He sees his son and he has compassion. He sees his son in brokenness. And all thoughts of vindictiveness are gone. And he does something unusual. It was not unheard of, but it was very unusual for older men in his society to run. It's undignified for them. But he doesn't care about dignity. He goes and he pulls up. There's an old phrase from the old King James called he girded his loins, which means he would have pulled his robe up to free his legs, and he starts sprinting down the road towards his son. And without thought, he just wraps him in this massive hug. He kisses him all over his neck. And when the son tries to repent, the father has forgiven him. He's taken this backpack off of his son, and he restores him to relationship. Why? Because the father is good, and he's full of forgiveness. And I don't know about you, but I remember that there's been times in my life where I've blown it, I've screwed up, I've done something, and I've gone to God and I've said, I'm sorry. But then all of a sudden I blow it in the exact same way, and I got to go back to God. And now I almost feel embarrassed. Like I almost feel like I can't go back. Like he forgave me for that. Why would he keep forgiving me again? Why? Because sometimes I think we approach God with a very limited view of his forgiveness and his mercy. But when the forgiveness and mercy of God is real, we actually see it should be unlimited. That we go back to God time after time, 70 times 70. Like we see it over and over, the deep well of forgiveness from our God. Because our God does not sit there longingly waiting for you to screw up and to come groveling back so he can lord it over you and say, told you you couldn't do it. You failed. He's sitting there anticipating, looking for you, waiting for you. For when you make the step to come back as a prodigal child, all of a sudden God will sprint to you, wrap you in his arms, and smother you with kisses, not because of how bad you were, but because of how good he is. Because of his deep and abiding love for you. And in reality, that's where the parable should stop. It would make sense in the context of everything if the parable stopped there. But the parable actually began with a man had 2 sons. And there's an older brother. And the older brother is out in the field. He stayed home. He's inherited his part, but he's still not making his own money off of it because it still goes to the father. And he comes near the house and he hears music and dancing, right? And so he called one of his servants and asked him what's going on. And the servant says, hey, the brother's home. We're partying it up because he was dead and your dad's so excited. And what does the older brother do? Instead of being excited that his brother's alive, he becomes angry. And he refuses to go in. Because what I think the older brother does is the older brother has been carrying around his own backpack as well. And this one was preloaded. But his is not one of guilt of the things that he has done. This is a backpack of resentment about all the things he didn't get. All the ways that he's been messed over in life. All the ways that he has become a victim. He answers his father because he's angry. He goes, look, I've been slaving for you, right? You never disobeyed. You never even gave me a young goat. Church, resentment is born out of a sense of entitlement, that you were owed something. The older son thought he was owed the father's celebration because of his faithfulness. But the older brother is actually still using language that says, God, it's not about relationship with his father. He's not in adoration and doing this in love. He's doing this for his money. He's doing this for what he is owed. He is a prodigal who never left home. He walked away from his father, but he never left the house. Boy, that could be a good description of some people in the church who've been here all this time, but you still walked away from the Father. You've left the Father's heart. Why? Because the Father's heart over the return of the younger son is one of celebration and joy. The brother's heart is anger and resentment. His heart is so far away from his father's. He is a prodigal who has never left. And when we allow resentment into our life, resentment ruins relationships. If you are resentful of your friend, it's hard to want to go and spend time with them. If you're resentful of your spouse, it is hard to be intimate and close with them on any emotional level. But what if you're also resentful against God? How hard it is to have a relationship with God, because resentment ruins relationships. But the father, in his amazingness, while the older brother is carrying around his backpack here of resentment, which is sitting him, and with every step makes him a little bit more. He wants to add a bit more, another block of resentment into it. The father comes out to him. He doesn't wait for the son to come to him, to the older son. He runs out to the older son as well, because the father wants to take this backpack off of the older son too. He wants to give him freedom from the resentment so they can have the intimate relationship again. And so he pleads with his son. And then the older brother stays angry in it. And then he goes and expresses his anger. And the father goes, you've always been with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate because the brother of yours was dead and is alive again, and was lost and was found. And what I find fascinating in this parable is it doesn't finish the story there. The older brother, we don't know if he goes and says, you know what, God, you know what, Father, you're right. Would you take my backpack from me? Or whether he goes, I don't care. And he keeps the backpack for the rest of his life. But the point of the story is not what does the older brother do. The point of the story is what are you going to do? How do you see yourself in here? I think this story offers us 4 opportunities for something amazing to happen. The first one, this. For those of you who've been carrying around a backpack of guilt because of the things that you've done that that you've broken God's heart with, the ways that you've been disobedient to him, you have an opportunity today to allow the Father to take this backpack off of you and to respond with the experience of freedom from your sin by experiencing the forgiveness of your Father. For those of you who are carrying around a backpack of resentment, it's different, but it's equally heavy because you haven't gotten what you've been owed, you feel. The Father comes to you this morning in order to take off your backpack if you're going to let him. How does he take these backpacks off? Because he sent his real son, our Heavenly Father sent his son Jesus to die on a cross so that all of our sin and all of our resentment can then be given over to Jesus, who will bear those for us and give us eternal life. All you've got to do is say, take my backpack, take my guilt, take my shame, take my sin, take my addiction. You can today have him take off your backpack of guilt. You could today have him take off your backpack of resentment. But maybe you're not filled with either one of those. But maybe you're like the Father. And right now you can think of somebody who has hurt you. And today, I think this passage affords us an opportunity to be like the Father and offer forgiveness. Church, I don't know if you are like me. I'm always trying to pursue in my life becoming more like Jesus, more like God. I think the scriptures call me to that. Church, you're never more like God than when you forgive somebody who has hurt you. You're never more like God than when you forgive those who didn't do what you wanted, who didn't live up to your expectation, who hurt you, who broke you. And I'm not talking about necessarily restoring relationships of something that's unhealthy, but I am saying forgiveness is an internal thing in your own heart and soul that is really between you and God. And you can experience the freedom that forgiving somebody else brings to you here today as you would release the pain. So you can have your father take your backpack of guilt. You can have your Father take your backpack of resentment. You could be like the Father and offer forgiveness to somebody who's hurt you. Or it's entirely possible that you are somebody who is just watching it. It's really difficult to see on this screen because of the light in this room. But if you see on the picture here, you see the son kneeling before the Father, and you see the older brother staring down. And just beside to the left of the brother's hands, you see a small face. That is the face of Rembrandt himself. He paints himself into his pictures, and he's watching the whole scenario happen. And maybe you are somebody who you've already allowed your Father to take your backpack of guilt away from you and shame, and you're walking in freedom. You don't particularly feel resentment for what is happening in your life, and there's nobody in your life that's hurt you. Well, what is our response for those that are like that? I think God calls us to, through the story, remember what God had did for you. How one day, maybe years ago, maybe months ago, maybe minutes ago, God freed you from that backpack of guilt, and now you have a response to him, which is what we call worship. And so, what will your response be to God today?